So for my paper, I basically studied the literature on the social cognitive and neurophysiological aspects of mimicry and group cohesion. So as an intro and background, my interest in this area came from basically a concern for how consultants can increase the adoption of evidence-based practices. And since consultants inherently work with people, I thought it would be important to focus on building rapport. So the key questions that I focused on answering for my lit review were: what are the mechanisms associated with rapport? And how does the quality of a professional relationship predict outcomes? So one of the more common phenomena that I came across when I basically searched the literature to answer the first question was the role of mimicry. And this was first demonstrated experimentally by Chartrand and Barg in 1999. They actually termed it the chameleon effect, and basically this involves interaction partners kind of mimicking each other's behaviors, facial expressions, and mannerisms when having a discussion. And so in Chartrand and Barg's study, they found that by deliberately manipulating the mannerisms of a confederate or someone who posed as a participant, but who actually was trained and recruited by Chartrand and Barg to, basically engage in specific types of postures and behaviors, they found that those deliberate experimental manipulations actually caused changes in the participants' behaviors as well, in a manner that was consistent with mimicry. Interestingly, the conditions where mimicry occurred also corresponded with higher, in the participants, higher ratings of perceived liking and smoothness of interactions, which I think both could be pretty good proxies for rapport. And also, in looking at who tended to engage in higher mimicry or more frequent mimicry, they found that individuals who rated themselves highly on a measure of perspective taking, which is kind of a cognitive form of empathy, if you will, like the ability to step in the other person's shoes and at least understand where they're coming from, those people tended to mimic more frequently than other people. And actually, empathy proper, or the ability to kind of feel the emotions of another person, they also did a measure on that particular attribute. And they found that empathy itself, in the emotional sense, did not correspond with more frequent mimicry, which I thought was interesting. So it's more of the cognitive aspect that is associated with more behavioral mimicry. And then Hale and colleagues in a study 21 years later looked at just how quick and or automatic is mimicry. And the reason that they wanted to test this is because it could have implications for like the specific neurological mechanisms that facilitate mimicry. And what they found was, using very precise temporal measurement, they found that head movement mimicry between like the leader, so to speak, or the person who did like the behavior first, and then the follower, that delay in mimicry was only about 600 milliseconds on average, so it was extremely rapid. And this implied that the human mirror system, I think we've all heard of mirror neurons, this essentially implied that the human mirror system, that's what the HMS stands for in this case, that might be involved. And in looking at a more direct measure of HMS activity, Hoagveen, Chartrand, and Ophe looked at they actually looked at EEG activity as an index of HMS responses. And so they looked at what are called mu rhythms, and it's basically it's a type of pattern in the EEG like trend that they measure. And they looked at those rhythms in mimicry and anti-mimicry conditions. And so the anti-mimicry condition was where the confederate would deliberately change their behavior if they saw the participant having a tendency to mimic the confederate. Then the confederate would deliberately change their behavior so that they would avoid any kind of mimicry. And the results suggested, as far as those mu rhythm patterns, the mu rhythm patterns in the mimicry conditions were consistent with previous research showing what those mu rhythm patterns look like in situations with HMS involvement. So this seemed to indicate this provided neurophysiological evidence to suggest that the human mirror system is involved in mimicry as well. And so and then also the involvement of the human mirror system could influence other perceptions of the quality of the interaction. So they also took measures of, kind of like in the Chartrand and Barg study, measures of liking and smoothness of interactions, which I think are just proxies for rapport. And again, those mimicry conditions were associated with greater measures of rapport. And then the last relevant study that I wanted to cover for this presentation involved Picasso and colleagues, who looked at a study of group cohesion and various salient outcomes. And group cohesion is basically a combination of task cohesion, which is basically like a shared valuing or prioritization of a specific like team project or goal, and interpersonal cohesion, which could be thought of as, I think of it as like rapport, basically. And the results suggested that interpersonal cohesion piece, that early rapport, played the most important role in the team's satisfaction over time, but task cohesion was also important. So building that initial rapport was very important for the team's overall evaluation of how effective the team was and how satisfied they were. And then also throughout that time span, being able to become aligned as a group towards the shared goal was also important. So conclusions and future directions. Based on the research I did, some of the recommendations I would have for consultants include: really do your best to understand the perspectives of consultees, especially early on, because this will probably result in like an automatic increase in behavioral mimicry, which could then lead to increased rapport without really having to try anything deliberately. Just by understanding the consultee's perspective, you should be able to increase rapport. Also, building positive relationships with consultees early on is very important for the long-term success of the consultation itself. So that really is, that early rapport is worth prioritizing early on. Nevertheless, it is also important for both you and the consultee to be well aligned in terms of your goals. And then for future directions, I'd be curious to know if research could be done on measuring the preciseness of mimicry movements, and also combining those with EEG measures to get even more conclusive evidence of HMS involvement. And here are my references, and thank you for watching.